obviously this acts in some ways as a celebration, but also I thought it'd be good to share some enthusiasms and privilege. And one of the privileges of working on the Tate exhibition, of course, was getting to visit Twombly and see him work, well, not working in the studio, but see his studio as he made things. He never allowed anyone to watch him paint, famously. And so I thought it might be rather nice to just show some of these incredible images of the studio, both in Lexington and Gaeta. You see Sai's studio in Tasta's film, but of course in that film you don't see him making anything or painting. He's just being in his studio. And these are a series of photographs that we took over a period of about a year and a half, I think, around 2008, as we were visiting Sai and talking to him and watching him make things. So here you have these wonderful paintings which were shown, I think in 2009, I'm losing track now, which the phrase reads, leaving Paphos ringed with waves, and I'm forgetting now which sort of line of poetry that's from, but it'll come back to me. But he's used it before. He used it in a group of paintings called the Sorceress Paintings from 2000. And again, of course, you see the boats here. This is still in Virginia, this rather cramped shopfront studio. And you see, I mean, even the canvases are turned over onto the floor. It was the spaces he worked in were often very confined and quite humble. This is just a rather beautiful photograph of him in his house in Gaeta, and the window overlooked the bay, so he could observe these effects of, light playing across the sea, this sort of idea of mist and clouds changing, which you see very much in the Four Seasons. And then this is the house in Gaeta. So he had two studios in Gaeta. One, he painted in the house, which, the rooms were fairly small. It's where the Four Seasons were painted. And then later on he took an industrial unit, which we'll look at in a second. So these are some of the Bacchus paintings from 2006, I think, being painted. And then this is the largest studio that Sai had in Gaeta, which was this rather simple industrial unit, rather sort of unassuming looking. And these were a series of paintings he made as we were finishing the Tate show. And we were very privileged to see these being painted over the course of several weeks and months.
And these paintings are now in Munich, I think I'm right in saying?
Yep, the Brandhorst Museum.
Yeah, in the Brandhorst Museum.
And so they're on the theme of roses. And this is the first set he painted. He painted a second set, and there was a show at Gagosian in London, which you may have seen in the end of 2008 or 9. It's all a blur now. I need to learn my dates. But basically, there were these paintings on panels, which looked at literally roses and had various poems on the theme of the rose and all of the sort of poetical associations of the rose to do with transience, love, time passing. So different authors from Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot. And if we sort of carry on going through, we'll come back to, you see here, all of these different inspirations pinned up as he painted, from sort of Netherlandish 18th century still life painting through to rather sort of quotidian photographs of flower arrangements. And also, this is really interesting. I mean, you would never...
And we are.
Exactly, yeah. You would never fathom this if you didn't know, but we might see a photograph of it. I can't remember if I included it. The actual structure, this sort of multi-part panel with these cartouches where the text impinges on the image, it comes from a sort of heraldic tomb that Sai saw somewhere in the countryside in the middle of Italy. And he had this photograph of himself taken standing in front of this tomb, which had these 4 different slabs. And in front of this sort of heraldic device, these inscriptions. And you would never know that was the beginning of these paintings unless you were fortunate enough to see them being made in the studio. Of course, the use of colour is very notable, and his paintings got bolder, more colourful as he got older. He began to use just acrylic paint exclusively. Rather extraordinary. These sort of clashing colours. And then you see here, this is already, these photographs are taken about a month or so after the first set. So the large painting, which when you saw it the first time around, was just had those white marks. You see it here now, finished in its final state. So this is in the summer of 2008, I think just after the Tate show opens. And so this is before they went to Munich. And then, some of these repeat, but this is from Rilke, one of his favorite poets. I mean, the use of color, I think, is really extraordinary. And Sy was never really thought of as a great colorist, I don't think. I don't think he even thought of himself as a colorist, but towards the end, it's one of the defining features, I think.
I think you could probably say that color came into his painting, I think probably through work on paper in the early 80s, with the a sudden and much more intense engagement with nature that characterized those paintings, and in particular the paintings that have to do with light.
So here's some of the inscriptions and just some details. I mean, of course, the other thing that's notable in his painting is how quickly they were made. They had to be made very, very quickly. If you think about how fluid acrylic paint is now, it has to be handles. These were painted in a very spontaneous manner. And this often sort of dogged Twombly during his career, the fact that, there's this cliche that, anyone could do that or it's easy. And of course, it's the opposite. It's incredibly difficult to make paintings which are so spontaneous and free-flowing. And he talks a lot in conversations with us and in the interview about how, he didn't paint 9 to 5. He had to be inspired. And he would often spend a lot of time in the studio looking at a canvas and thinking about the marks to make, and then had to kind of summon up the creative will to make these bold gestures. I mean, this is incredibly bold. I mean, the ways that he deletes. The first time we saw these paintings, this was my favorite panel, these beautiful sort of maroons. And I came back about 2 months later and I was sort of heartbroken because Sy had taken this sort of flesh-colored paint and deleted a whole passage and then written over it. But it's, of course now I think it's exactly the right thing, it works. But he was incredibly bold in his compositions, again, sort of in the final few years.
Of course, when you see all the slides together like this, it gives you the impression that there was this intense activity, which of course there was in short bursts. But he often described sitting in the studio for hours or days, contemplating an empty canvas before deciding, in the act of deciding what should be done with it.
Yeah.
And in fact, although Nick talks about, quite rightly so, about corrections, amendments, and change, for many of these quite late paintings, there are surprisingly few changes and surprisingly few overpaintings.
Yeah. They became much more spontaneous in a way. These are actually the Bacchus paintings which are on display at Tate Modern now, which you see in the studio. And then here you just have some of his... Our conservators were really fascinated to see these images because a lot of this hasn't really been documented. The types of paint he was using, the types of paintbrush, the way he was mixing paint. And then if we go a bit further on, of course, these paintbrushes on the end of sticks, so which gave him much amplified his gesture. So you have these, broad brush strokes, which of course nod to the work that Matisse was doing in old age. Of course, Matisse was bedridden for the final few years of his life. And that's where he produced the cutouts, but also he would draw onto the wall using charcoal on the end of a pole. And I think Sy was very much thinking back to that. And here again, you see the painting with some of the different influences layered up from Renoir to ads for cakes and flowers. Again, this kind of heraldic motif. Okay, and I think now we're moving on to the show.
Okay, so Nick, this isn't the first show that has brought together contemporary or living artists with the work of the collection here, but it does take a very different form. I mean, there have been shows of Lucien Freud presented a group of paintings, I think in these galleries here. Howard Hodgkin took half a dozen paintings and dropped them into various places in the gallery. But this brings together two artists in a much more direct confrontation. And I just wondered whether you had any hesitation about doing it.
Lots, but not enough to stop me. I always thought it would be a sort of risky proposition because, I mean, we'll look at this in more detail, but of course they're so different. I mean, arguably they're more different than they are alike. And really it was, so how the show began was working with Nick on the 2008 Tate show and having these conversations with Twombly where we talked about his life and his work and hearing the name Poussin mentioned, again and again, which I thought was very interesting. For me, it was a huge surprise because of any sort of old master artist I could think of, I wouldn't have thought of Poussin in the same breadth as Twombly or being the artist who had inspired him over the years and in many ways I think was one of his sort of touchstones, one of his favorite artists. I mean, there's many artists that he was looking at, but Poussin seemed to emerge again and again. And so I was thinking about this, and it seemed to me like a sort of radical way to think about this idea of influence and the opportunity to do something which we don't tend to do with exhibitions of old master and contemporary artists. We tend to sort of pair them visually. So we say, this looks like this, or this was painted after this, or copied after this. And I thought to do an exhibition where perhaps two things look nothing alike. I mean, there's some paintings in the exhibition which do happen to look comparable or similar, but that's not really the point. I was almost more interested in things which look completely dissonant. But what I wanted to think about was how to trace this continuum and to think about how in the 17th century Poussin was finding a way to reinvent all of these themes, whether it was mythology, ancient history, landscape painting, and the way that Twombly had done that 3 centuries after him. So in completely different languages. I mean, just to be obvious, one is figurative, one is abstract. The mark making is completely different. I mean, we could list the differences. But just to actually think that there is a continuum there. And I firmly believe there is. Maybe some people might want to disagree, but I think if you believe in what Twombly's painting and you believe the claims about what he's looking at and what he's thinking about, then there's definitely a continuum. I mean, it's undeniable, even though the two things look very different. So that was really what drew me to the idea that it just seemed the chance to do something very unusual and very, very particular as well in this museum with this collection in these spaces.
I think it also probably grows out of the fact that when Twombly was developing as an artist in the early 50s, when he would have been in his 20s, he describes his being in New York and spending an enormous amount of time in the galleries, the commercial galleries, looking at the work of contemporaries. No time at all in the Museum of Modern Art or the Whitney Museum or indeed any of the other museums of the art of his own time or the immediate past, but visits to the Frick. When he applied for a scholarship to go to Italy in the mid-50s, he described a wish also, well, to go to Italy, but he also described a wish to go to the Louvre and look at 17th century French painting. So he talks about Poussin, but that was a love and an interest that had been with him at that point for 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
But it's nevertheless a dangerous thing to do, isn't it, to put them two artists together in this way?
Yes, I think obviously there was risk, and I was curious. Even if things work on paper, you never know. You can plot things out and see how things might look side by side on paper, but until you see them physically together, you never know how those two things are going to speak to each other, let alone in the spaces. So it was always a risk for me. I mean, I have to say, in the end, just again speaking personally, I'm happy with how the two things sit together, but I really didn't know until we opened up the crates how these things would look side by side.
So what have you learned about Poussin?
I've learned a lot about Poussin over the last few years. I mean, I had a pre-existing interest in Poussin, I should say that as well. That, it just happens that Twombly and Poussin are two of my favorite painters for different and similar reasons. And so obviously as an undergraduate, I'd studied Poussin's painting, and it just seemed, again, like a wonderful opportunity to go back to something I'd loved and really think about it. in a very sustained way, so really over the last 3 years. So this was really a sort of labour of love that I worked on in my weekends, more or less. I mean, what I sort of hoped in the exhibition was that we might think of Twombly as being perhaps more classical than some skeptics might believe, and we might think of Poussin being somewhat more radical than our eyes have grown used to appreciating. So should we just look at some images just to think about this? So of course, these are two self-portraits, or portraits, which are in the catalogue. You see them both staged amidst their paintings. It's a rather funny juxtaposition. Twombly was very happy with this I mean, he just thought it was funny. He thought it was, of course, it's a coincidence, but, you know, just that these two young artists, well, not so young. And, I mean, I don't want to sort of go over too much over the exhibition, but of course, as Nick mentioned, Twombly's first trip to Italy was in 1952 with Robert Rauschenberg. And so even as a young man, as a boy, he had this desire to go to Italy and to make contact with the classical past. And so what I wanted to do here was just to show that this is part of a history, and, you know, the idea of the Grand Tour, which really reached its apex in the 18th century, so the century after Poussin. So here you have this wonderful photograph taken by Rauschenberg of Sai about 2 days after arriving in Rome in August, September 1952. And of course, this beautiful drawing by Fuseli, where you see this archetypal artist sort of in despair about this, you know, these wonderful fragments and how an artist can possibly contend with this history, which seemed like an interesting question for Twombly as well. And then I'm just trying to get to some other images, but these are the two sketchbooks by both Poussin and Twombly that they made shortly after coming to Italy and North Africa. So you see them actually studying particular artifacts, objects, and, you know, different, even different colours. So there's a very kind of systematic approach to begin with in the way that Twombly was looking at Europe and North Africa. But if we just get to some images. So these are, of course, paintings from the first room. And I should say that what I wanted to do was really to work with the collection at Dulwich. So rather than just to begin a sort of free association, I started from a very particular place, which was thinking about the paintings here, which, of course, you know, there's a wonderful collection of Poussins, and really sort of going out from that and then getting things I needed to sort of trace this trajectory, whether it was other works by Poussin or works by Twombly.
I mean, you show this painting, obviously, between the two shaped canvases here. Mm-hmm. But in the catalogue, you show it against a very different work by Twombly. Mm-hmm. Were you unable to get that work for the show, or were you...
This work?
This one, the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Yep. Okay, so basically in the show, so of course you have Roman Road, flanked by these two shaped canvases from 1985. And really the point here is about landscape painting. It's about the landscape in the light of the Roman Campagna, which they were both painting. These are painted in the north of Rome in Bassano, where Twombly had a house. And really it's him looking out of the window and observing light and clouds playing over the hills and forests outside his studio window. And Poussin is doing something very similar, but in almost diametrically opposed ways. So Poussin's painting is very, very meticulous, methodical. There's almost no brushstroke. And he's trying to capture this effect of light filtering through trees. Twombly's doing the same thing, but with the opposite method. So this very spontaneous way of painting with his hands. So this is really the starting point of the exhibition. This was always the idea from 3 years ago to have these two paintings flanking Roman Road. It's really the beginning of the show. But as I obsessed over these two painters over 3 years, which I really did, one weekend I had this sort of epiphany, and I was looking at Roman Road, and I suddenly thought, it's such a funny composition. I mean, it's not like any painting that Poussin had painted elsewhere. You know, this very symmetrical composition, this rectilinear road receding from the immediate foreground into the distance. And I was thinking, it reminds me of a painting that Twombly made, and I had to go through the catalogue raisonné, and of course, it's this painting, which is it's a very unusual painting in Twombly's career. It's called Blue Ridge Mountains, Transfixed by Roman Piazza. So you have this idea about the landscape of his youth, the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, being juxtaposed with this sort of classical symmetry of a Roman Piazza. So it's about past and present and nature versus a kind of cultivated landscape, which is interestingly what Poussin is also painting. There's arguably a pendant of this work, which is the Greek Road in the National Gallery. And so both these paintings are about, a cultivated landscape and a wild landscape. And so I should say, yes, I actually thought about trying to shoehorn this painting into the exhibition. I had this epiphany a few months ago, and it was one of the last conversations I had with Twombly when I went to see him a few months ago. And he liked the juxtaposition, but he didn't feel this was a strong enough painting to really, so it worked better as an illustration than in the show.
Okay.
But yeah, that gives you an idea about how the ideas developed over the course of the 3 years. And then we should just mention this as well, which was another starting point. And so this is the first work that Twombly made, which referred directly to Poussin in 1960, so shortly after he sets up house in Rome permanently. And so you have this sort of schematic Poussin landscape with this pool. So of course this is Poussin's landscape with Diogenes from the Louvre. I mean, there's many Poussin landscape paintings you could compare this with, but this is the one that I chose to make this comparison. So you have this, in Twombly's painting, this pool flanked by this, lush greenery. And so obviously Twombly's looking at this, almost this formula that Poussin develops for landscape painting and finding a way to convey that in a very kind of schematic, almost cartoon-like fashion. Should we carry on going through? And then, of course, this is the other, not just starting point, but really overarching framework for the exhibition, which are these 2 paintings about the idea of Arcadia. Again, size painting Arcadia from 1958, painted 1 year after he moves to Rome. And this beautiful Poussin painting made 4 years after he moves to Rome, which is now in Chatsworth. And this seemed interesting for several reasons, one of which was just the idea of Arcadia being this sort of timeless realm. And what I wanted to do in this exhibition was to look at the two, to really think about the idea of the continuum and the timeless, because I felt that for Sai, as Nick was saying, there was never really any distinction between past and present. It's all part of a continuum. And in conversations with him and thinking about what he was looking at as a young man, it wasn't what you would expect. He was looking at, Pollock's painting in the 1950s, but he was also going to the Frick. And so I really believe that for Twombly, everything was part of a continuum. And that's really what his whole life was dedicated towards doing, was keeping alive these memories of antiquity, of the classical past. And so one idea was that idea of, that Arcadia is this imaginary timeless realm. It was imaginary and timeless for Poussin, just as it is for Twombly. But of course here, the other idea very explicitly was the idea of the inscription, and the way that in Poussin's painting, these shepherds are happening across this sarcophagus in this blissful, timeless realm, and then making out this inscription which says, et in Arcadia ego, meaning, even here, death is present. And of course, this seems to chime in a very interesting way with the role of writing and the calligraphic and the inscription in Twombly's work.